Hello and welcome. This is Redesign. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Annegret Böhnemann. I'm a designer at For Junior Customers in Amsterdam, and with my team, I support organizations to create tech that is responsible towards people and planet. We create the Redesign podcast to inspire and support listeners in their journey to do the same, to create more sustainable, respectful, and inclusive tech. Have you ever wondered how your digital product or service could harm people? How it can enable or even reinforce violence? Imagine a couple, happily married, sharing a bank account for years. Now they separate. They get divorced, they argue heavily, they have disagreements about their finances. And even though both have access to their shared account, the bank app only allows one true owner. This person can withdraw access from their ex-partner. Within a few seconds, the ex-partner will have no access to their money. Whose responsibility is the harm that is caused? What responsibility do the creators of this bank app carry? This time at Redesign, I'm joined by Eva PenzeyMoog, who's a designer and author of the book Design for Safety. As creators of technology, Eva says in her book, we tend to hope that what we create can be experienced in ideal circumstances in an ideal world full of ideal users. In reality, however, the world is messy. It can be unfair, unjust, and unsafe. That's why Eva is on a mission to explain how technology can be weaponized by people to harm other people. She breaks down misconceptions, makes use cases tangible, and illustrates best practices that show how to do differently. I myself don't find this an easy subject. It affects me. It costs energy to think about the dark sides of the world. And yet I find this topic so important that I wanted to better understand how to approach and practice it. So I reached out to someone who knows well, in the hope that also you will find Eva's perspective inspiring and motivating. So enjoy our conversation. Oh, and in the case you hear some noise in the background, this might have been a cat playing, enjoying the simplicity of life. Hey Eva, nice to see you again.
Hey Annegret, nice to be here with you.
Really good to see you. I'm super excited for this conversation because I've been reading your book at the end of last year, and preparing for this call, I actually looked up a little bit about you, and I realized that you have not always worked as a designer. So I would like to ask you what has brought you to that shift in your career?
Yeah, so I had a first career out of college in a nonprofit that was focused on education and the high school dropout crisis in the United States, which was really great experience. But I think a lot of people who worked in nonprofit will understand what I mean when I say that it's just a burnout factory. And I burned out like many people do, and also sort of hit a place of not, able to really like advance very much, kind of looking at my finances, like this isn't going to work out long term. So I wanted to have a career change, and I wanted it to be in tech. And I looked into like all sorts of different roles, eventually landed in UX, and felt like it was going to be possible to still have a sort of like mission driven approach in this space, because I still really wanted to do some sort of socially justice focused work within the space somehow. And I thought that within UX, I could be very human centered and advocate for people. And when I first joined tech, I did a lot of mentoring of people, of especially women and people of color trying to break into the industry, and kind of got some mission driven feelings that way. And then, obviously I found sort of like the designing for safety stuff and really took that pretty far. So I've been able to sort of recreate some of the things that initially drew me to nonprofit within tech.
So what made you care so much for this topic of safety then?
Yeah. So it was very education focused. But during that time, I also did this other thing, which was purely as a volunteer, but I became a certified rape crisis counselor. So once I sort of had that certification, I was working with a different nonprofit, or I should say volunteering, basically having times where I would go into emergency rooms and help people who were there seeking services after a sexual assault. So I learned a lot from that training and from working with survivors and that experience. And one of the things I learned a lot about was domestic violence. And we actually, at the nonprofit then that I was working at, partnered with a group to deliver domestic violence education to our core members, the people who were actually in schools working with students. Mm-hmm. And there was my friend, a man who was the training manager, felt very ill-equipped to kind of deliver this training. I know nothing about this topic, and it feels like something I shouldn't just, try to do with no knowledge or experience. So he asked me to help out, and that kind of started off just becoming really immersed in domestic violence and doing education around it. And I ended up doing a lot of sort of different trainings for different groups, just about like what it is and how to help survivors specifically. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of my entry point, I guess, into the topic. And then when I came into tech, I still sort of had that lens, I suppose, and was sort of applying it to tech and seeing different ways that our technology was either sort of passively enabling abuse or not so passively enabling it, or just missed opportunities to sort of like understand that someone might be experiencing some kind of harm and offer some type of support. So that's kind of how I got into it in the tech space.
Has your understanding of the term or the area of safety and domestic violence changed in the tech area?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to learn about it. The examples are really everywhere. And I've learned yes, to answer your question, it has, my understanding has changed a lot in the years since I started sort of first looking into this work. And I've realized just the really sort of terrifying breadth of ways that harm can happen and what that actually looks like in all sorts of different areas. So at first I was sort of focused on sort of like security things, like products that people are using in like high-rise apartment buildings was sort of the first place where I was working on a client and was like, wait a second, how can we prevent someone who has like left their abuser from their abuser being able to access? Like we have this whole app, we have this like front desk person who is there ostensibly to help keep the residents safe. And there's a registered list of guests, but abusers are really, really sneaky and they're really creative. And like, how can we acknowledge that reality and sort of keep people safe? So it was much more like sort of direct with people. And then as I've gone on, I've realized just all these sort of different ways, and that so many different things can be weaponized for abuse that are much less obvious than that.
Could you maybe provide us some examples on how technology plays a role in there? So I can imagine that the topic of safety feels sort of very close to us in the everyday life, but what does technology have to do with all of this?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, it has everything to do with it. I think just in terms of, I mean, I could spend like 4 hours going through all the different examples. And, if you buy my book, you'll be able to get sort of like a lot of different examples that span a lot of different spaces. So, but just in terms of your one about sort of like traveling, and I think that's getting at the idea of location data, which is such a huge part of this. So the technology that's enabling things like Google Maps and location sharing is one that is really, really ripe for abuse, where a lot of stalking happens. And then there's also things like the Strava fitness app that a lot of is really popular with like people who do series like running and cycling. And that one had also, essentially been enabling people to see the entire routes of people who were like sort of near them for a while, even if they had set all of their location data to be private. You were still able to kind of see their route, which is obviously really dangerous because it can essentially reveal where they live and just, their patterns. So yeah, the fact that technology is enabling these things, it's exciting that there's so many new things that are possible. And, like sharing your location on Google Maps is such a useful feature. And I've used it a whole bunch of times in very legitimate ways that are not abusive or stalking. But almost all of these things, they just haven't considered, how can this be used for harm? How will it be used for harm?
Can I maybe ask in a very provocative way, is it really the problem of tech, or isn't it the people who are creating it or also using it? Aren't those people ultimately responsible?
Oh, absolutely. The people who are, so specifically, I'd say it's the people who are creating it, who are ultimately responsible. Just like the people who create, things like cars are a really good sort of example that I look to a lot, that the people who design and build cars, they have so many different safety regulations they have to follow. You can't just create a car that has like crappy brakes or that doesn't have seatbelts or these different things, because we recognize that this is like a public safety matter. And I have a whole conference talk about this topic that I made recently that's sort of explaining that this wasn't always a thing with cars. They used to be totally unregulated, really, really dangerous. And then there was this sort of like uprising against car manufacturers. And then eventually governments got involved. And now every country has some regulation over the cars in their country, which is a really good thing and keeps a lot of people really safe, because it used to be so many injuries and deaths that were completely preventable. And I feel like that's sort of where tech is right now, is in that like space before we had all that regulation back in like the 50s and 60s. And it is ultimately the responsibility of the people who are designing and creating the technology to understand how it's actually impacting the people who are using it. And then I specifically want the other thing you said about, is it the people who are using it responsibility? My answer is like, honestly, not really. Just like if you buy a car, you're not going to double check all of these different things. You're going to trust that, the manufacturer has made it to be safe, and that the government is effectively enforcing regulations and identifying car makers who, like skimp out on these standards, and it's going to hold them accountable. So I think kind of just like that, we shouldn't have to be looking at every new app or piece of software, or whatever it is that we use, with this lens of like, let me do a full audit and figure out all the ways that this could be used for harm. Like, I just don't think that's reasonable.
Yeah, I see. What about those people, though, that are using it with malintentions? So the ones that actually are on the abusive end, so to say, they obviously carry responsibility for their intentions, but then they use tech that is making it possible, right?
Yep. I mean, yes, definitely. It's a really good point that ultimately abusers are the ones who are responsible for the actions that they are, choosing to take to harm other people. And again, I feel like the car analogy is so useful here. We think about people can and do use cars in malicious ways. Sometimes, you might be trying to run someone off the road, or you might, like intentionally hit someone who's on the street with your car. There are still these things that are going to happen. But the fact that people are going to try to find ways to misuse the product doesn't mean that we should just not do anything at all and throw our hands up and say, well, it's impossible. Like, we can still do a lot of things to make sure that like the car itself is safe, and that, people aren't dying in really pointless car accidents because like the sunlight is reflecting onto their chrome display and going back into their eyes, which is like what used to be a thing back in the 50s. People were just like blinded by sunlight constantly, and then would get in really dangerous car accidents. So I think that, we can't let perfect be the enemy of good, and people are always going to be doing bad things with the products that are out there, but there's still a lot that we can do to prevent a lot of those bad things from happening.
Yeah, and I really enjoy the way you put it, that it's ultimately the creator's responsibility to think this through, right? To take some level of responsibility, to be considerate there. In your book, you speak about prioritizing groups of people, and you say if you unintentionally prioritize abusers, you're actually causing harm. What do you mean with unintentionally prioritizing abusers?
Yeah, so I think if we're not going to intentionally prioritize a vulnerable group, that doesn't mean that there's no group that is getting prioritized. Like, I think it's this idea that neutrality doesn't actually exist when we live in a system of various oppressions, where there's institutional oppression, different systematic oppressions, as well as individual oppressions that are going on, against, like, we know, like, white privilege is a real thing, male privilege is a real thing. It's kind of like, if you just are going to design for a default group of people, it's probably going to work better for men, and it's probably going to work better for white people. Like, like how Siri doesn't recognize like higher pitched voices or different accents. I think that's a good example of like, oh, well, we were just, designing for humans, but actually, we're not neutral actors, despite our best intentions. Like, we're raised in these systems, and it's a lot of work to unlearn. So I'm not like trying to place blame on white men. But I do think it's, our responsibility to unlearn the different sort of oppressions that we've grown up learning. And part of that is recognizing that we don't have the ability to actually be neutral in this type of work, and someone is going to get prioritized. And in the safety part of it, we're going to be prioritizing people who want to use our devices for harm, or our software, whatever it is in tech that we're making. We're prioritizing those people if we aren't paying special attention to the people who will be harmed and prioritizing them.
Mm-hmm. What's your suggestion? So it's not very common that I can go to my clients and say, well, look, I think the topic of safety really needs to be on the top of our priority list, because obviously there is a couple of topics that a couple of people want on the top of that list. So what's your approach in still giving it a space?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. And it's a really common question that I get a lot of, like, how can I convince the people around me to also care about this and to also prioritize it? And especially like the stakeholders, like the directors or VPs who are under a lot of pressure to deliver things quickly and cheaply and whatnot. So I think I have a couple different like sort of ways that I approach this and that I kind of encourage people to approach it. So the first is making like an actual plan, which I have a chapter in the book dedicated to what I call the process for inclusive safety, which goes through the different sort of steps in the different parts of the process where you can incorporate these things. And then figuring out like actual time estimates, because like what you said is sort of like a first approach. And it was definitely my first approach of like, I just want to go to someone and be like, hey, this stuff really, really matters and we need to think about it. And and I understand, from a VP standpoint, like that's actually a really hard thing to just agree with. But I think it's easier for those people in those positions to agree to something like, we want to spend an hour figuring out how our research plan that we have in place for the next 3 months can prioritize people who we think might be harmed. And then we want to spend 4 hours doing extra interviews with people we've identified who have experience in this area. And then we want to spend 2 hours thinking about like what we've learned from that research and like brainstorming how it's going to what this will actually look like for a product. And I think when you start to sort of break it down into those much more reasonable chunks, it's a lot easier to say yes to, especially because like the reality is that a lot of this stuff actually doesn't take that much time to do. It can be like as little as just like a few hours, like every couple of weeks that you're spending on this stuff. And then, if your VP is like, you can have half that time. It's like, okay, well, you still have at least that time. Like you still got something. So as long as you're able to do something, like it's going to be better than nothing. So that's one approach, is to like make really specific asks of what you actually want to do. And then the other approach that I really like is to find sort of allies within your organization, so that when you do bring this up, like in a public meeting or a team meeting or whatever, 3 of the 9 people who are there are also going to immediately say like, yeah, oh yeah, and I think that's a really important topic. And I agree, like it would be really great to spend time on this. And I think we really need to, is going to also make it easier for you as the person who brings it up, because it can be really awkward and uncomfortable, and then also more likely to sort of have the motion get passed, so to speak.
Makes plenty of sense. What would you say is the biggest difference between let's call it a normal human-centered design approach and one that does look at safety? That's a great question. So I feel like human and sort of standard human-centered approach, I think this means different things to different people. And I think it is like constantly changing. It means something different than it did like 10 years ago. But to me, at least, like what I see as like a sort of standard human-centered design approach does a lot of things that align really well with a safety-centered approach. Thinking about different groups, thinking about like accessibility, I know is a really important topic that has gained a lot of like traction and is becoming more of a standard thing to talk about and incorporate, of being inclusive of people with different abilities and different needs.
so I think that that actually, like, I'm hoping that eventually, maybe in like 10 years from now, we will be at a point where human-centered design also incorporates safety. But yeah, I think that the sort of main difference is that it's just safety, and sort of people in these really vulnerable situations are not something that are thought about. I mean, in any approach, really, including human-centered design approaches.
Yeah. One thing, or one question that you wrote in your book that really stuck with me was this idea of ask yourself the question, could there be anybody that gets harmed by this product? And I really love this idea of just asking myself a self-reflection question, right? Because it immediately kicks off a whole other universe of thinking about the work that I'm actually creating. On the other hand, it also made me wonder, doesn't that stick to my own experiences then? Because I'm limited to my own imagination, my own experience, the knowledge, and so forth. But I have maybe not been in the situation of a person that has, experienced harm, or that is in an abusive relationship, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, that self-awareness is really great. And I think not everyone has that, but I think it's something that's really important to recognize your own sort of limits of what you can actually get at. And again, this feels like it's sort of asking yourself this question and maybe spending like half an hour just thinking and reflecting on it. Feels like a really important first step into the sort of rest of the process, which is like actually doing some targeted research into like, okay, so what might this look like for someone in an abusive situation, or someone who's like had a stalker, or these different things. Can kind of like kick off sort of that part of the process. But I think, it's absolutely worth doing, even if you recognize your limited experience, even if you aren't able yet to do these sort of other things, it's still going to sort of get you closer to the goal of keeping people safe.
Yeah, that makes plenty of sense. Have you seen this going wrong in a project? Like where your efforts were not recognized, or where you felt like you kept running into walls?
So I mean, I haven't seen it go wrong. I am like in the sense of the way that sort of like some other design practices, I think a lot of times eventually they get sort of like watered down and sort of co-opted into these other meanings that is actually really far away from the original intention of the people who made it. I mean, I see that with human-centered design, where so many companies are saying like, oh, we have a human-centered design approach, and then that just doesn't actually mean anything. So that is something that like kind of keeps me up at night, is like knowing that like some company someday is going to use this as like a marketing tactic. But in terms of it, if seeing it go wrong, I mean, I've definitely had the experience of sort of being told like, no, like we're just not going to prioritize that, or no, that's an edge case that we don't really have to worry about, or the sort of tactic of like, yeah, that's super important, put it in the backlog and we'll like deal with it later. And then it just never, that's like the way that, whatever stakeholder makes these ideas, like the backlog is where it goes to die. So I've definitely experienced those things, and it is really disheartening. But I think like, hopefully, I think things are, well, no, not hopefully. I do believe that things are slowly changing, and that it makes sense that people are sort of resistant at first. And it, like, again, not to just really harp on about the sort of transformation of the auto industry, but it's like, I draw a lot of inspiration from that whole like 30-year process of the auto industry going from completely unregulated and really dangerous to fully regulated and much safer. I think we're kind of in the sort of early days when it comes to safety. So I think it makes sense that people are like resistant, or just, I think a lot of times they just don't understand what it means. And it's in a much more like education sort of phase. And then the sort of phase after that is people starting to like actually change their behavior, and there ideally being some sort of like laws and regulations, policies around this type of stuff, but we're not there yet. So I don't get too discouraged in the long run, even if I do hate it in the moment, where I'm just like, you don't care about humans. Like it's kind of how I feel. And then I reflect and feel a little better.
What is it that keeps your motivation up then?
Definitely hearing from people who have had success stories with it. Once in a while I'll get just like a random like message on LinkedIn or Twitter or something in my inbox of someone saying like, we were able to identify this issue that we had never thought about thanks to like someone who had read your book or someone who had seen your conference talk. And those sorts of things definitely keep me going.
That's super nice. Are there, like, so I imagine this is a tough work, because you get to think about things that are not pleasant. I mean, let's put it on the table. This is not fun. I mean, the topics that you look into are not fun in itself. They are relevant and they are important, but it's not like you're gonna laugh a lot about it. Do you set any boundaries for yourself to handle all of this? And what sort of boundaries are those?
Yeah. So you're really right. Like this topic, it's really dark and it is really hard to engage with every day over a long period of time. And I've definitely sort of like gone through different phases where it gets to be too much. Usually when I'm like trying to do research into a specific thing and I end up just reading like lots of different articles or studies and there's like some specific story of something like especially like horrible that like an abuser did, that I'm not going to share any specific examples because it's things that I don't even want other people to have in their heads unnecessarily. But I think some tactics that I've recognized in terms of like putting up those boundaries is being able to recognize when you're hitting that point of just feeling really bad and like really, really discouraged about everyone and everything in the world, and just closing my laptop and saying, okay, I'm taking like a 5-day break or however long I can kind of do that for whatever it is I'm working on. So and which I couldn't recognize it for a long time. Like it's definitely, I think, a skill that people have to develop as they're doing this kind of work, but being able to recognize when you're hitting that point. And then also therapy is really important. And I do talk to my therapist about this a lot. And I think, it's a tricky thing, especially in the United States where not everyone has access to that type of healthcare can be really tricky. So for people who do, definitely taking advantage of it. And then, also this is where things like, universal healthcare, like lots of European countries have, becomes like a really important thing. There's all these overlaps where I'm like, well, we need this for lots of reasons, but also because like people like me need access to free mental health care. So also sort of advocating for those things, but taking advantage of therapy and then sort of recognizing your limits and just straight up taking a break when you need to are the two most important things for me.
So taking a break in the middle of a project sounds like the right thing to do, obviously, right? Because you do need it. How do you handle that though with, let's say, your employer and the client, that you say, well, look, we hit a wall here. We need to step a little bit away from this until we feel good enough about this again. I can imagine it's not that easy to put a project on hold, right?
Yeah, totally. It's definitely easier said than done. And I do have a whole chapter about this, where I talk about the sort of issues of doing research into like really dark topics, whether it's domestic violence or, whatever other thing you've identified, like maybe there's like a really intense racism component or something with like child abuse or whatever it is. So some of the tactics, I think a lot of it comes down to having like a project manager or some type of leader who's bought in, who can say like, yeah, after every interview with someone from this group that we've identified, you spend like an hour decompressing and you don't have another interview right away. Or, we take turns where this person is interviewing for a few days and then it's this other person. So there are different tactics that can get put in place. But I think, yeah, it's really tough when you're sort of in the actual moment of having a deadline and having a client who's expecting things. And I think the other thing I'll say in terms of that is that it's really important to sort of like recognize upfront that this is going to happen. Even though it probably feels like it won't, that you're like if you haven't actually done it, it's hard to sort of convey the impact that it does have. So I really encourage people to like, even if you haven't experienced it, to just assume that it's going to emotionally impact you in some way, and then sort of build your schedule around being able to have some time away where you're kind of working on other aspects of the problem. Because there's always other problems, other research, other things that aren't to do with this topic that you've identified in terms of harm. So being being just very conscientious and intentional about how you sort of plan the project, and recognizing that it is going to happen, even if you don't necessarily think it will. It definitely will.
Thanks so much for providing this very realistic point of view, Asa. I think that that's very important to know. Though I would love to ask you, Asa, let's say if you were to hold a motivational speech to convince other designers to work on this, what would you say?
Well, so that was actually kind of my first conference talk, designing against domestic violence, that I did on this topic. Was very much like with the goal of motivating other designers to care about it. And I think my main tactic with that talk and with like the book and most things I do is to tell stories of actual people who have gone through this. Because we can talk about like statistics, and we can talk about like, how much a country spends on healthcare for people, seeking services after being assaulted by a partner, former partner. But none of those things stick with you as much as the actual story of the person whose partner turned off the nest in the middle of the night, and they woke up freezing in a really cold Canadian winter, which is one of the stories in my book. Like humans are just from like prehistoric times, whatever, we're designed to remember stories, and that's just going to stick with you so much better. And also I think really help people understand the impact of what's actually happening. So my motivational speech would continue to just be full of stories for sure.
Right. Okay. We'll make sure to also link that original talk about domestic violence somewhere in the description.
Great.
What would you recommend others that want to get started in this area? Maybe designers or also developers. What's the first steps that you would say they should walk?
So I think the first steps are to start to learn about this topic. So I mean, you can buy my book, but there are other things you can do. There are other folks sort of working on this depending on the actual space you're in. Just like do a Google search and see, like, look for people who are working on it, sort of within whatever the like niche, like topic that your company is working on. Try to find areas where it's been used in some type of harmful way, or is just doing something harmful. There doesn't always have to be like a bad actor involved. That's why the process is called the inclusive safety process, is because when people go through it, they often recognize ways that their product is going to sort of do harm in some sort of way without someone intentionally doing something to someone else. It's just like, oh, actually the way that this, HR platform works is it's going to expose people who identify as trans, and we need to, actually make sure that that doesn't happen. So there's so many different ways that this can look, but just spending the time to try to learn a little bit about it is, I think, the first really important step, so that you can get your brain thinking about how your product is going to be used for harm or do some type of harm is the main thing. And then also talking to the other people on your team, and just if you can like go through some of that learning process together, it's going to go a lot better than if you kind of come in later and are like, I've learned all this stuff, I'm really fired up, and people are like, I don't understand what you're talking about, and I don't like care the same way you do. If you can go through it together, that's ideal.
Super nice. Is there anybody who you look up to, or somebody that you love to read or listen to, that you would recommend us?
Yeah, so there's a woman, Leonie Tanzer, who is, I believe she's Austrian, working in England, and she's specifically focused on Internet of Things and gender-based violence. And her work is really amazing. And she runs a program for like grad students to learn about this stuff. So following her on Twitter is a good idea. And she just writes like really well about this stuff. And then there's someone named Molly Dragowitz in Australia, who I came across her work over and over again as I've been like researching this topic over the last few years. And she's one of the sort of, well, I think of her as like one of the leading academics in the space of technology facilitated domestic and family violence. And she just writes really well. And, lots of academics write in a way that's like intentionally really opaque and like difficult for people without a PhD to understand. And she doesn't do that. So I recommend her work as well to folks who are learning more about this.
Great. Very good. All right. One last question. what is the one thing that you would like listeners to remember from our conversation?
Oh, what a great question. I think the one thing that I want people to remember, take away from this conversation is that you absolutely can make a difference, even if it's really small, and even if it's not the sort of like major impact that you are setting out to have. Your like, and even if your team is like not into it, or your company says no, or whatever it is, that you're still making a difference. And even just planting the seed in someone's mind of this topic as something that matters. Like I think a lot of people, and I've seen this where people don't care about something or think about something, but if you've been sort of bringing it up regularly, like 3 years later, they're going to be like, oh yeah, actually, like we should probably think about this thing. And you might never even get to see that impact. But I do really want to encourage people to remember that they can make a difference, even if it's just them.
Thank you so much. That's a very nice way to end. Thank you, Eva.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a really great conversation.
My pleasure. And for those that listened in to Redesign Podcast, we hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to know more about how to design for safety, please check the description of this episode. We made sure to link Eva's favorite resources. If you'd like to listen to more talks of this kind, you can subscribe to our podcast to not miss any future episode. Well, and if you'd like to know more about how designing with responsibility in mind could benefit you and your customers, please reach out to us. We left our mail in the description. So thanks again for listening and have a wonderful day.